So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce a pillar of community, a trailblazer in Black Canadian studies, and one of my personal heroes, Dr. Andrea Davis. Dr. Davis, yes, give it up. Dr. Davis is a professor in the Department of Humanities at York University and the academic convener for the 2023 Congress of the Humanities and Social Science that is to be held at York. Prior to this role, she was a special advisor on the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies Anti-Black Racism Strategy. A former Canadian Commonwealth scholar, Dr. Davis earned a BA in English and Spanish Literatures, first-class honors, from the University of the West Indies in the Mona campus, an MA and PhD in degrees in English at York University. Dr. Davis's research is rooted in anti-racism, feminism, and analyzes the questions of race and gender through a focus on the literary and cultural productions of Black women. Her most recent book, Horizon Sea Sound, Caribbean and African Women's Cultural Critiques of a Nation, imagines new reciprocal relationships among Black women, Indigenous, and other racialized women, and offers a new reflection on the relationship between the Caribbean and Canada. Dr. Davis establishes and coordinates the Black Canadian Studies Certificate at York and is an award-winning teacher, most recently receiving a 2021 3M National Teaching Fellowship. She holds cross appointments in the graduate programs in English, interdisciplinary studies, gender, feminist, and women's studies, and social and political thought. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much, Jaleesa, for that incredibly generous welcome. Thank you to Naila, who was one of my students when we were both children. It is such a pleasure to see how you have grown and how you continue to do this work with such grace and such brilliance and such vision. Thank you. Thank you to the other artists and to all of you who have decided to share space with us today. I'm calling my reflection today toward a vocabulary for living. The preposition toward in the title suggests movement that is in progress, not finished, but insistent, not static. The indefinite article clarifies that the provocations I offer today, this way making, is only one of many possibilities open to intervention and new directions. Vocabulary suggests a sitting with language, but also a dismantling of what we have inherited as normative linguistic registers in order to create something else to think and speak and otherwise. In a vocabulary for living, I am thinking specifically about the contours of Black life, its possibilities and impossibilities, its insistence on surviving in the face of ongoing violence and death. I've organized my talk into three movements, each marked by history and the contemporary moment. Catastrophe, living beyond death. Hope, living in relation. And freedom, living in the future now. For those of us who are the descendants of Africans enslaved in the Americas, the desire for life and freedom begins with the rupture that occurred in the past. The loss of memory, the interminable crossings and secrets buried in the Atlantic, and the impossibility of return, all wedged in the history of transatlantic slavery. And even for those Africans living in diaspora, who can map a way back to some kind of home, some kind of discernible and knowable origin. The specter of chattel slavery and its link to West Africa also mark a profound accusation, an association to the bodily mark of slavery, which is Blackness. Any vocabulary toward living for Black peoples in the Americas must attend to this catastrophe and consider what has been required for us as Africans to live in the face of, despite, and beyond death. What language, Dion Brand asked in A Map to the Door of No Return, would describe that loss of bearings or the sudden awful liability of one's own body? The hitting or the whipping or the driving, which was shocking. The dragging and the bruising is involved. The epidemic sickness with life, which would become hereditary, and the antipathy, which would shadow all subsequent events. In her essay, Jamming Still in Blank, M. Norbesi Philip, in searching, hunting for the words to describe the horror of the Middle Passage, discovers the word Mafa from Kiswahili, meaning terrible occurrence, great disaster, or great tragedy. From the language of the people who live along the East African coast, the Zanzibar archipelago, coastal Kenya, the Tanzania seaboard, and northern Mozambique, we've inherited the word Mafa, which has come to refer to the capture, removal, enslavement, and murder of millions of Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, and the lasting impacts of this loss, this catastrophe on African peoples and their descendants who were enslaved. This great disaster, Philip notes, is both an ending and beginning. Ancestors, language, knowledge, customs, irretrievable, forgotten, available only in broken shards of desire that cut rather than heal. This catastrophe is a beginning that is itself an ending, a beginning of unending loss, an epidemic sickness and antipathy which would shadow all subsequent events, as Brand explains, shadowing the continent, west, east, north, and south, and enabling the continuing theft of African land and resources, but shadowing still Black people in diaspora, cut off from their past, suspended in repeating time. In her soon-to-be published essay in the special issue of Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies, dedicated to a discussion of Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, French and Algerian scholar Françoise Bourges tries to account for the contemporary formation of On Freedom, those new departures from the 21st century's doors of no return. African women, children and men of all ages embarking on fragile boats on the coast of Libya and Tunisia, hoping to reach the shores of Europe. Women, children, and men from Venezuela, Haiti, and Brazil, walking through the Colombian jungle to reach the United States through Panama, Central America, and Mexico. Women, children, and men from Syria, Afghanistan, and Cameroon, wandering in sub-zero temperatures in the forests on the Belarus-Poland border, the multiple doors of no return that racial and class politics are building. These are only some of the multiple contemporary manifestations of what Saidiya Hartman calls living in the afterlife of slavery, or the wake of slavery, as Christina Sharp so compellingly writes. Other manifestations of this catastrophe, death through police violence, poverty, lack of education, absence of care, we already know well. This living in the quotidian shadow of death has required that Black people become adept at practices of survival, practices of flexibility and plasticity, the ability to evade, contort, and shape shift in the face of violence. In Oratorio, the 2018 performance written and composed by Toronto artists Motion and DJ Eloquence, The Girl, played by Motion, performs multiple acts of what I call sound travel. In her first act of sound travel, the sounds of the ocean, chains, whips, and the crack of a ship transport the girl through time travel into the past. Sounds of pain mingle with sounds of humming and rhythm and the chords of Negro spirituals. But as DJ fades in the talking drum, B-Girl rises in a kind of resurrection and transforms, shape-shifting into Carlotta Lukumi, the Yoruba woman who led a slave uprising in Cuba in 1843. If they find me, beat the drums. If they catch me, beat the drums. If they take me, if they tie me, when they break me, when they bind me, beat the drums. But while B-Girl's chant foreshadows Lukumi's death, B-Girl refuses to concede defeat, and so she sound travels again, transforming into Josephine, an enslaved girl on a plantation in the South Carolina Sea Islands where she pats Juba. Shout, Josephine, shout. Got a pain in my head, shout, 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 Josephine, shout. Finally, as Josephine draws a map of the North Star on the ground to take her to the Underground Railroad and freedom in Canada, we hear the sound of trains. Running to catch the Underground Railroad, B-Girl ends up on the Toronto subway as she sound travels back to the 1990s and her personal narrative and coming of age story. Despite every attempt to destroy her, she survives in another place, another time. In her 2021 book, We Do This Till We Free Us, abolitionist Mariam Kaba offers us a definition of hope as discipline that I suggest takes us beyond escape and survival and toward a practice of relationality and reciprocity. As Kaba explains, I always tell people, for me, hope doesn't preclude feeling sadness or frustration or anger or any other emotion that makes total sense. Hope isn't an emotion, you know. Hope is not optimism. Living in the afterlife already in the present is kind of a form of escape, but it is really, really important for us to live in the world and be of the world. Grounded hope, in other words, is a discipline we must be committed to practicing every day. She continues, in the world we live in, it's easy to feel a sense of hopelessness, that everything is all bad all the time, that nothing is going to change ever, that people are evil and bad at the bottom. I just choose differently. I choose to think a different way, and I choose to act in a different way. In my recent work, I've considered what the current violence against Black and Indigenous peoples might teach us and how it might dictate that we act. What might constitute new terms of non-hierarchical affiliations of community between Black women and other marginalized peoples in the world? How can we enact a practice of hope as discipline, a grounded hope in which our freedom is not predicated on the unfreedom of others? What does it mean to live in relation to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and the Caribbean as Africans dispossessed from our own Indigenous lands and forced to labor against our will in the service of colonial nation states on stolen land, aiding against our will the subjugation of the Indigenous peoples who were here thousands of years before our original forced and continuing forced migrations? To register this idea of relationality, or what Shania Cordes calls relational difference in a Caribbean diasporic context, I turn in the second chapter of my book to the Guyanese poet Grace Nichols. In her collection of poems, I Have Crossed an Ocean, Nichols draws on her Guyanese roots to resituate African, Indian, and Indigenous Caribbean women's presence in the region. The poems in the section startling the flying fish are narrated through the persona of Carrie Wilma, in whom I see one entry point from which to consider Black diasporic women's reciprocal relationships. As a complex representation of Caribbean women's intersecting histories and oppressions, Carrie Wilma is simultaneously the Indigenous ancestress, keeping guard over the land and sea, and the African diasporic mother who is a witness to her generation's historical and contemporary subjugations. In the poem, I, Carrie Wilma, Watched History, Carrie Wilma appears as a two-headed Janus, a witness to both the histories of Indigenous conquest and African enslavement. As a two-headed spirit, she is the Indigenous guardian of the shore, who witnesses the arrival of the conquistadors, but she is also the African foremother bearing witness to the enslavement and ongoing unfreedom of her generations. In the poem's first stanza, as the Indigenous guardian, her head rises from her hammock on the Caribbean shore and turns toward the sea, where she sees the arrival of Columbus's ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and discerns the coming brutalization. Yes, I, Carrie Wilma, watched history happen like a two-headed Janus, however far apart heads may be. The first head rose up from the hammock's languorous belly and turned toward the winged ships of Columbus's faith, his bright dreams, which soon turned for us into nightmares. In the poem's second stanza, her head rises from deep within the bowels of a slave ship and swivels back like a Joanne, the faceless plantation spirit whose feet are turned permanently backwards. This head gazes at the past, at the shards of broken pots, the waves of palm wine betrayal. Body facing forward and head and feet facing backward, Carrie Wilma is connected to multiple places and histories, desiring a lost, irretrievable past. Unable to map a return across the Middle Passage, she joins the other half of herself on shore. As the embodiment of the dual spirits of Indigenous and African women, Carrie Wilma also witnesses the arrival of other ships carrying indentured laborers, Indian, Chinese, Portuguese, and Irish. The Atlantic Kalapani and Sargasso Sea flow into the Caribbean Sea and the shorelines of the Guianas. Each crossing demands a new reckoning of the land, water, and air, a consideration of the means by which survival is possible under conditions of conquest, but also a consideration of what it might mean to honor the right to freedom of the subjugated peoples of the world with whom we share the land, water, and air. And in note 189 of the section preliminary entries toward a dictionary of untranslatable Blackness in her newly published book, Ordinary Notes, Christina Sharp invites other writers to think with her about the meaning of life. For me, life is a possibility that remains, a heart that will not stop loving, a glimpse of something beautiful, even in the midst of grief and dying, propelling us forward. The ability to see, to hurt, to feel, but also to dream, to move, to sit still, to exist in relation and not possession, to be. For Kinesia Lubrin, Even still, in the Black precarious scenes of this early 21st century, we cannot stop making a fuss about freedom, the total meaning of our lives, where imagined or real our measures would exceed any rupture in colonial time, angle our brief long movements toward life, and yet we cannot stop making a total freedom. This idea of life as contingent of freedom, I try to think through in my work through the concept of the future now. The future now, rather than marking a place of final arrival, of completion, or even wholeness, requires merely that Black people refuse the violence now, today, of white supremacy, secular colonialism, and the forgetful nation. It is the insistence that each configuration of the present must remain livable because we are here and we know that life will continue because no matter how they try, we will not die. In Black women's attempt, the future now exists in Black women's attempt to improvise in defiance of Black death, to improvise in defiance of the surveillance strategies of the state, and to live otherwise. Ultimately, this is what I'm trying to reach toward in a vocabulary of living. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. And I think your concept of the future now is something that we all can meditate on, not only today in the exhibit, but going forward.